In a small, quiet village surrounded by vast fields and dense forests, there lived a girl named Zelina. Her beauty was unmatched, but her life was far from perfect. After losing her mother at a young age, her father had remarried a woman named Madame Tura, who brought with her two daughters, both selfish and vain. Zelina's father, a kind-hearted man, had hoped his new wife would provide the motherly love his daughter needed, but fate had other plans. Tragedy struck again when her father passed away unexpectedly, leaving Zelina completely at the mercy of her stepmother. Madame Tura's cruelty knew no bounds. She saw Zelina not as family, but as a servant, someone to shoulder the burdens of the household. Every day, Zelina was tasked with cooking, cleaning, fetching water, and tending to the garden, while her stepsisters idled away their time, obsessing over their appearance or gossiping with neighbours. Despite her hard life, Zelina remained kind-hearted and humble, her spirit unbroken. Her beauty radiated not just from her appearance, but from her gentle soul, which made her a favourite among the villagers, though this only fueled her stepmother's jealousy. One day, excitement rippled through the village as news spread from the royal palace. Prince Adewale, the heir to the throne, was searching for a bride. The prince was known not just for his handsome looks, but also for his wisdom and fairness. His parents, the king and queen, had decreed that the prince's bride must be chosen not for her wealth or status, but for her kindness and humility. To find her, a grand ball was to be held at the palace, where maidens from every corner of the kingdom were invited to attend. The announcement sent waves of anticipation across the land. For many, it was a chance to dream of a life beyond their wildest imaginations. In Madame Tura's household, the news caused an uproar. The stepmother and her daughters immediately began planning how they would capture the prince's attention. Madame Tura was confident that one of her daughters would become the next queen. As for Zelina, she was given no such hope. Instead, her stepmother laughed cruelly, mocking the idea that someone as insignificant as her could ever dream of meeting the prince, let alone marrying him. Zelina listened quietly, her heart aching with both sadness and longing, as the preparations for the ball began. As the day of the royal ball approached, Madame Tura's envy towards Zelina grew stronger. Though her own daughters were well-dressed and pampered, even they couldn't match the effortless grace and beauty of Zelina, who shone even in her simple, tattered clothing. Every glance at Zelina reminded Madame Tura of her own insecurities, and the thought of the prince noticing the girl at the ball filled her with rage. She resolved that under no circumstances would Zelina be allowed to attend. The household buzzed with activity as Madame Tura and her daughters prepared for the grand event. Dresses were tailored, jewellery polished, and perfumes carefully selected. While the stepsisters revelled in their anticipation, Madame Tura concocted a plan to ensure that Zelina wouldn't even have the slightest chance of setting foot near the palace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Madame Tura summoned Zelina. With her signature icy tone, she commanded Zelina to fetch water from the farthest stream outside the village, knowing well that the task would take her all night. This particular stream was infamous among the villagers for being eerie and mysterious. Rumours swirled about strange lights and haunting whispers that came from its depths, and few dared to venture there after dark. Madame Tura's lips curled into a satisfied smirk as she handed Zelina a heavy clay pot. "You'll need to fill this completely before you return," she said sharply, "and don't come back until it's done." Zelina, who had grown accustomed to her stepmother's harsh demands, nodded quietly. She knew better than to argue or protest. With the ball just hours away, she understood that this was Madame Tura's way of keeping her away from the palace. Yet there was little she could do. Her heart ached with longing as she watched her stepsisters giggle and twirl in their gowns, dreaming of the grand event that she would never see. As night fell, Zelina wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and set off towards the stream. The clay pot felt heavy in her hands, but the weight on her heart was even greater. The journey was long, the path winding through dense forests and uneven terrain. With every step, the sounds of the night grew louder, the hoots of owls, the rustling of leaves, and the distant howls of unknown creatures. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, and an unsettling chill hung in the air. When Zelina finally reached the stream, it was as if she had stepped into another world. The water shimmered unnaturally under the moonlight, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. It was too quiet, as if even the insects and animals dared not disturb the stillness. She hesitated for a moment, clutching the pot tightly before kneeling by the water's edge. The task was simple, yet every movement felt weighted by an unshakable sense of dread. As she dipped the pot into the water, faint whispers seemed to rise from the depths of the stream. At first, she dismissed them as the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to make sense of the voices. They were soft yet insistent, calling her name in tones that sent shivers down her spine. For a moment, she considered running back, leaving the pot behind and defying her stepmother's orders. But Zelina's sense of duty and resilience held her firm. She reminded herself that she had no choice. With trembling hands, she continued to fill the pot, her mind racing with both fear and determination. Little did she know, her stepmother's cruel plan to keep her away from the ball was about to set in motion events far beyond anyone's imagination. The forest felt alive as Zelina approached the stream, but not in the way a forest should. The night was unnaturally still, with no rustling leaves or chirping crickets to break the silence. The stream lay ahead, bathed in silver moonlight, its surface smooth and undisturbed like a sheet of glass. But something about the scene felt off, too perfect, too serene. As Zelina stepped closer, she noticed a tree at the edge of the water, its bark glowing faintly with an unearthly light. Its branches swayed gently, though there was no wind, and she could swear she heard faint whispers emanating from it. Zelina hesitated, her grip tightening on the clay pot. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this strange place behind, but she reminded herself of the task at hand. Madame Tura would show no mercy if she returned empty-handed. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she knelt by the water's edge and dipped the pot into the cool stream. As the pot filled, the whispers grew louder, though they remained indistinct, like a language just beyond her understanding. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see someone or something emerge from the shadows. But the forest remained empty, save for the glowing tree and the shimmering stream. Just as she was about to lift the pot, a faint rustling behind her made her freeze. Her heart raced as she turned, clutching the pot to her chest like a shield. Out of the darkness stepped a figure, cloaked and unassuming, but with an air of quiet confidence. "Don't be afraid," the man said gently, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His voice was calm and warm, immediately putting her at ease despite the strange circumstances. He wore simple clothing, but there was something about him, his posture, his piercing eyes, that hinted at someone accustomed to authority. Zelina straightened, her initial fear replaced by curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the slightest tremor. "I'm just a traveler," the man replied with a small smile. "I often wander through the kingdom to see its beauty, but tonight it seems the stream has led me to someone far more intriguing." Zelina felt her cheeks flush, though she didn't fully understand why. She looked down, suddenly self-conscious of her tattered clothing and disheveled appearance. "I'm no one special," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. "If that were true, why would the stars choose to light your path so clearly?" he said, motioning to the glowing tree and the moonlit stream. Zelina glanced at the strange tree, her brows furrowing. "I don't understand what you mean," she said, shaking her head. "Perhaps you will, in time," he replied enigmatically. Then, noticing the heavy pot in her hands, he gestured to it. "May I help you?" Before she could protest, he took the pot from her and filled it effortlessly, as though its weight was nothing. Zelina watched him, a strange mix of gratitude and bewilderment stirring within her. She had never encountered someone so kind, so willing to help without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," she said softly as he handed the pot back to her. The man smiled again, his expression thoughtful. "You're different from most people I've met," he said after a moment. "There's a strength in you, a kindness that shines even in the darkest places." Zelina didn't know how to respond. She was used to being overlooked, treated as insignificant. Hearing such words felt foreign, almost unreal. "I should go," she said finally, shifting the pot in her arms. "It's late, and my stepmother will be angry if I take too long." The man nodded, though his eyes lingered on her, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "Of course," he said. "But before you go, may I ask your name?" "Zelina," she replied hesitantly. "Zelina," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "A beautiful name for a beautiful soul." She turned quickly to hide her blush and began walking back toward the village, the heavy pot swaying slightly in her arms. The man watched her leave, his expression unreadable, before quietly following her from a distance, careful to stay hidden. For Prince Adewale, though Zelina had no way of knowing his true identity, this chance encounter was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Disguised as a commoner to explore his kingdom and better understand its people, he had stumbled upon something far more precious than the landscapes or villages he sought to see. The girl by the stream had captivated him, not just with her beauty, but with her humility and grace. As he trailed her silently through the forest, he resolved to learn more about this mysterious girl who had so effortlessly captured his attention. Little did either of them know, their fates had become intertwined in a way that would change both their lives forever. As the grand night of the royal ball arrived, Madame Tura and her daughters were a flurry of excitement and arrogance. Draped in extravagant gowns and adorned with glittering jewels, they radiated the confidence of women who believed they had no competition. Madame Tura, in particular, felt assured of her plan. Zelina was far away at the stream, likely struggling with the heavy clay pot in the eerie darkness. There was no way she could interfere with their grand ambitions. "Remember, girls," Madame Tura said with a smug smile as they prepared to leave, "tonight is your chance to secure the prince's favour. He'll choose his bride from among you. Make sure you outshine everyone else." The stepsisters giggled, preening in front of the mirror one last time before stepping into the carriage. As the horses trotted away, the house fell silent, leaving behind only the echoes of laughter and the faint scent of perfume. Zelina arrived home shortly after, her arms aching from carrying the heavy pot and her feet sore from the long journey. Exhausted and disheartened, she placed the pot in its usual spot and slumped onto the small wooden stool in the corner of the kitchen. Her mind wandered to the ball, imagining the grand palace, the dazzling gowns, and the joyous music she would never experience. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered to herself, "If only things were different." A soft rustling broke the silence, and Zelina glanced up, startled. Standing in the doorway was an old woman, cloaked in a faded shawl, her eyes twinkling with a knowing kindness. "Why are you crying, my child?" the woman asked, her voice warm and soothing. Zelina hesitated, unsure of who this stranger was or how she had entered the house. But there was something comforting about her presence, and the words spilled out before she could stop them. "I wish I could go to the ball," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But my stepmother forbade me, and I have nothing to wear, no way to get there. It's impossible." The old woman smiled gently and stepped closer. "Impossible? Nothing is impossible, my dear. Sometimes the universe has a way of helping those with kind hearts." With a wave of her hand, the woman conjured a light so radiant it filled the room. Zelina gasped as the light transformed before her eyes, weaving itself into the most stunning gown she had ever seen. It shimmered like moonlight, with intricate details that sparkled as if touched by stardust. A pair of delicate glass slippers appeared on the floor beside her, glowing faintly in the dim light. Zelina's eyes widened in disbelief. Who are you?" she stammered. The old woman chuckled softly. "Just someone who believes in your goodness. Now, hurry. The ball awaits, and I have one last gift for you." With another wave of her hand, a pumpkin outside the house transformed into a gleaming carriage, and 4 mice scampered forward, morphing into elegant horses. Zelina could hardly believe her eyes. "Go now," the old woman urged, "but remember, this magic will only last until the stroke of midnight. After that, everything will return to its original form." Overwhelmed with gratitude, Zelina nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her heart swelling with hope and excitement. She stepped into the carriage, and with a flick of the reins, she was off to the palace. When Zelina arrived at the ball, the sight before her took her breath away. The grand hall was filled with lords and ladies in their finest attire, chandeliers casting a golden glow over the marble floors. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly feeling out of place despite her magical transformation. But as she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. A hush fell over the crowd as people whispered among themselves, captivated by the mysterious beauty who had just entered. Even Madame Tura and her daughters paused, their smug expressions faltering as they took in the sight of her. They didn't recognize Zelina, but they couldn't deny the jealousy that flared within them. Prince Adewale, who had been politely greeting guests, turned at the commotion. His breath caught as his eyes met hers. He recognized her instantly, the girl from the stream, the one who had haunted his thoughts since their encounter. Without hesitation, he crossed the room, his gaze never leaving hers. Zelina's heart raced as the prince approached. She couldn't believe this was the same man she had met by the stream, now dressed in royal finery and commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He extended his hand, his smile warm and inviting. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. Zelina nodded, her nerves melting away as she placed her hand in his. The music swelled and the two began to dance. The world around them seemed to blur as they moved in perfect harmony, their connection undeniable. Madame Tura and her daughters watched in stunned silence, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. "Who is she?" one of the stepsisters whispered, her voice tinged with envy. "I don't know," Madame Tura replied through gritted teeth, her mind racing. Something about the girl seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. As the dance continued, the prince leaned in closer to Zelina, his voice low and sincere. "I knew there was something special about you," he said. "You're unlike anyone I've ever met." Zelina blushed, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and disbelief. For the first time, she felt seen, not as a servant, not as an outcast, but as someone worthy of love and admiration. The night felt like a dream, each moment more magical than the last. But as the clock in the grand hall began to chime, Zelina's heart sank. Midnight was approaching, and she knew the spell would soon break. She glanced at the prince, her eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow, knowing she had to leave before her secret was revealed. The grand hall echoed with gasps and murmurs as Zelina and Prince Adewale continued their mesmerizing dance. The prince's attention was entirely fixed on her, and it was clear to everyone that he had found someone extraordinary. Madame Tura, standing at the edge of the crowd with her daughters, felt her stomach drop. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the girl's face, her every movement gnawing at a sense of familiarity that she couldn't yet place. "Mother," whispered one of the stepsisters, her voice trembling with jealousy. "Why is the prince giving her all his attention? He hasn't even glanced at us." "Quiet," Madame Tura hissed, though panic was already gripping her. A cold realization began to creep in as she scrutinized the girl's face, her graceful demeanor, and even the curve of her smile. It was impossible, wasn't it? There was no way this mysterious beauty could be Zelina. She was supposed to be at home, far from the ball, exhausted from her errand to the stream. But the more Madame Tura watched, the more certain she became. Her face turned pale and her breathing quickened. This girl wasn't just a random stranger. This was Zelina, transformed into a vision of elegance and beauty. Before she could stop herself, Madame Tura pushed her way through the crowd, her steps hurried and clumsy. "Wait!" she called out, her voice sharp and desperate. The music faltered as heads turned to watch her approach. Prince Adewale stopped dancing and turned to face the interruption, his expression calm but curious. Zelina froze, her heart pounding as Madame Tura marched closer, her face a mix of fury and disbelief. This girl," Madame Tura stammered, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "She has no right to be here. She's not who she seems." The crowd gasped, and whispers rippled through the hall. Madame Tura's daughters stood frozen in place, their faces burning with embarrassment as they tried to shrink into the background. Prince Adewale raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanour unshaken. "And who exactly do you believe she is?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with authority. "She's a fraud," Madame Tura exclaimed, her finger trembling as she pointed at Zelina. "She's no noblewoman, no guest of the royal court. She's a servant, a mere girl from my household who has no business being here." Zelina's cheeks flushed with shame, her eyes darting between the prince and the crowd. She wanted to flee, to disappear into the night, but something in the prince's gaze stopped her. He wasn't looking at her with doubt or judgment. He was looking at her with quiet confidence, as if he already knew the truth and didn't care. The prince took a step forward, positioning himself protectively in front of Zelina. "And yet," he said, his voice firm and commanding, "she is here. She is the one who caught my attention, who danced with me, and who carries herself with more grace and dignity than anyone else in this room." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "Perhaps," the prince continued, his gaze narrowing as he turned back to Madame Tura, "the real question is why you feel the need to humiliate her in front of everyone. Is it jealousy, spite, or perhaps guilt for something you've done to her?" Madame Tura faltered, her bravado crumbling under the weight of the prince's piercing words. She stammered, searching for a response, but nothing came. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and the tide of opinion was clearly turning against her. The prince extended a hand to Zelina, his expression softening as he spoke to her. "Is this true?" he asked gently. "Are you from her household?" Zelina hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. She knew there was no use in denying it. With a trembling voice she nodded. "Yes, Your Highness. I live in her house, but I am no more than a servant to her and her daughters." The crowd gasped again, this time in sympathy and outrage. Madame Tura's plan was unraveling before her eyes. "And yet," the prince said, his voice rising to address the entire hall, "this is the girl who possesses the qualities I seek in a bride. Kindness, humility, and a pure heart. Not the women who seek to impress me with false airs or cruelty." His words carried a quiet authority that silenced every whisper in the room. He turned to the king and queen, who had been watching the scene unfold with keen interest. "Father, mother," the prince said, "I wish to make my intentions clear. I choose this woman, Zelina, as my bride. She is the one who has captured my heart." The king and queen exchanged glances, their expressions softening into smiles. "Then it is decided," the king announced, his voice booming across the hall. "Let it be known that Prince Adewale has chosen his future queen. Prepare the royal decree at once." Cheers erupted from the crowd, drowning out Madame Tura's spluttering protests. The stepsisters looked mortified, their faces bright red as they tried to avoid the judgmental stares of the other guests. But the humiliation didn't end there. The king raised a hand to silence the crowd, his gaze now fixed on Madame Tura. "As for you," he said sternly, Your behavior toward this girl is inexcusable. Your cruelty and deceit have no place in this kingdom. Madame Tura's knees buckled as the weight of the king's words hit her. Please, your majesty, she begged, her voice trembling. I meant no harm. It was all a misunderstanding. But the king was unmoved. You and your daughters are hereby banished from this kingdom, he declared, never to return. Guards, escort them out immediately. The guards stepped forward, and Madame Tura's cries of protest fell on deaf ears. The stepsisters clung to their mother, sobbing as they were led out of the grand hall, their dreams of royal favour shattered. As the doors slammed shut behind them, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. The tension dissolved, replaced by an air of celebration. The crowd erupted into applause as the prince turned back to Zelina, taking her hand in his. You have nothing to fear now, he whispered, his voice tender. You are safe, and you are loved. Zelina smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with gratitude and joy. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The sun rose over the kingdom, casting golden rays across the palace, which bustled with excitement and joy. The day of the royal wedding had arrived, and the grand hall had been transformed into a dazzling spectacle of flowers, silks, and shimmering lights. The entire kingdom seemed to rejoice, their hearts filled with anticipation for the union of their beloved prince and the girl who had captured not only his heart, but also theirs. Zelina stood before a grand mirror in her bridal chamber, dressed in an exquisite gown that sparkled like the stars. Her heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and disbelief. The girl who had once been confined to a life of servitude now stood on the brink of becoming a queen. It felt like a dream, one she feared she might wake from. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. The fairy who had helped her before appeared once more, her kind smile reassuring Zelina. You have always been worthy of this, the fairy said softly. Never doubt your place here. The love you have earned is true, and your kindness has brought you to this moment. Zelina nodded, her eyes glistening with tears of gratitude. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the chamber, ready to embrace her destiny. The ceremony was nothing short of magical. As Zelina walked down the aisle, the crowd erupted into cheers. The villagers who had once pitied her now looked at her with admiration, inspired by her resilience and grace. The nobles, who had initially doubted her, found themselves captivated by her poise and warmth. Prince Adewale waited at the end of the aisle, his gaze filled with love and pride. When Zelina reached him, he took her hands in his and whispered, You are everything I've ever hoped for. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt and genuine, reflecting the bond they had formed through kindness, courage, and mutual respect. When the ceremony concluded, the kingdom erupted into celebration. Feasts, dances, and music filled the palace and the streets, marking the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the couple, but for the entire kingdom. Meanwhile, Madame Tura and her daughters found themselves far from the celebration. Banished to a small, desolate village on the outskirts of the kingdom, they struggled to adapt to their new life. Gone were the comforts they had once enjoyed, replaced by the harsh reality of their actions. Madame Tura's once haughty demeanour had faded into bitterness, and her daughters, who had never lifted a finger to work, now faced the consequences of their selfishness. Rumours spread of their disgrace, serving as a cautionary tale to those who would seek to harm others for their own gain. Madame Tura, stripped of her power and influence, was left with no choice but to reflect on her cruelty. Though she would never admit it, the sight of Zelina's rise to grace haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder of what kindness could achieve. Back in the palace, Zelina embraced her new role as queen with humility and compassion. She devoted herself to the well-being of her people, ensuring that everyone, regardless of their station, felt heard and cared for. Her story became a source of inspiration throughout the kingdom, a testament to the strength of kindness and humility. The people adored her, not just for her beauty, but for the warmth she exuded and the fairness with which she ruled alongside Prince Adewale. Together, they brought peace and prosperity to the kingdom, their love serving as the foundation for their reign. As the years passed, Zelina's name became synonymous with hope and resilience. Her story was told to children as a reminder that even in the face of cruelty, kindness could triumph. The kingdom flourished under her and Adewale's leadership, and their love remained as strong as it had been the night they danced under the palace's golden chandeliers. And so, Zelina's tale came to a joyful conclusion, a life transformed by courage, a love born of sincerity, and a legacy that would endure for generations. The kingdom rejoiced in her triumph, and she lived happily ever after, proving that true beauty lies in the heart, and that goodness will always prevail over greed and malice.